All right, we're back, and in this section, we're going to talk about individualism versus collectivism. So, if we want to do just sort of a general comparison of individualistic societies versus collectivistic societies, typically individualistic societies are Western societies, and they tend to have a strong emphasis on the self and looking at each individual person as unique and different. Basically, all focus is on the individual, very minimal focus on group identity or group goals. In collectivistic cultures, which are typically going to be more Eastern cultures, but really most of the Southern Hemisphere cultures are collectivistic, they tend to focus on fundamental relatedness of all individuals. And so they tend to look at the group and the group members as part of just one giant unit, as opposed to a group being made up of individuals who may have different motives and goals and things like that. The only motive that really matters is the group goal, the group motive. So these are just sort of really good characteristic overviews of individualism versus collectivism. It's important to kind of understand these two ways of being within a culture, because these are the two big dividing lines between cultures that personality psychologists have really focused on. So let's talk about it in a little bit more detail. So when we talk about individualism versus collectivism, when we talk about the self, the independent self is much more common in individualism. Your sense of self comes from your individual traits in individualism. In collectivism, the self is seen as much more interdependent with other selves, and really you get your sense of self from the groups that you belong to. So your identity is not built from your own individual traits, but instead built from the collection of groups that you belong to, the memberships that you hold. Your life task in individualism is to discover and express your own uniqueness, figure out what your purpose is, figure out, what kind of person you are. Those kinds of things are really big strivings in individualism. And really there's this emphasis on finding what makes you different from other people. In collectivistic cultures, the life task is to maintain the connections that you have and to find a way to fit into the groups that you belong to, into the structures that you belong to. What matters in individualism tends to be our own self, our personal achievement, our personal fulfillment, our personal rights and liberties. In collectivism, what matters most is the group, the we. So maintaining solidarity within the group is more important than an individual's personal fulfillment. Fulfilling one's social responsibilities to the group could be their family, the group could be their work peers, whatever it is, your social responsibilities are more important than your personal rights and liberties. Maintaining your relationships is the paramount in collectivism. Now, it's a good time to take a moment and discuss the fact that I'm presenting sort of these oppositional things. This is individualism, this is collectivism, and you may notice that some aspects of both types of culture might be describing you right now, right? There's certainly, for example, when we talk about collectivism having an emphasis on relationships, well, even within individualism, there's an emphasis on maintaining healthy relationships, right? So it's not that you're one or the other. A lot of times what we find is that in our personal lives, when we're dealing with our personal direct contacts, most people look more collectivistic than when we're talking about like large structures, governmental entities, or nations or states or things like that. In collectivism, the sort of national pride is really common. This sense of duty to country is really profound in collectivism. So there's some overlap. You might be saying to yourself, "Oh, I must be from both cultures because lots of things, all of these things describe me, or lots of these things describe me." It's important to note that in general, when we talk about individualism versus collectivism, when we're talking about cultural impacts, we're talking about larger structures. We're not talking about your personal relationships. All right, let's resume. Coping methods. Individualists are much more likely to try to change stressful realities, whereas collectivists are much more likely to try to change their reactions to stressful situations. And so we saw that when we talked about stress and health and other things, that if you have that kind of tendency, when you're faced with stress, some of us have a tendency to try to solve the problem, to change reality. Others of us have more of a coping style where we say, well, I can't change the situation, so I need to change how I'm reacting to it. Morality. Individualists are much more likely to have varying morality that is not necessarily being dictated to them from above. They're much more likely to say, well, what do I think is the right thing to do in this situation? What would be my moral compass, right? Like that's a phrase that you have in individualistic societies that wouldn't be present in a collectivistic society, my moral compass. In collectivistic societies, morality is determined by your social networks. You are much more duty-based in a collectivistic society. So if the group needs it, it's your job. It's the moral thing for you to do what the social network needs. Relationships, individualists, we tend to see in individualistic societies that the members tend to have lots of relationships, lots of what they might call friends. That in a collectivistic culture, they wouldn't call people at that level of intimacy friends. They would call those, acquaintances or people I pass on the street or somebody I had a class with once. They wouldn't call those friends because one of the things about collectivism is that their friendships are much closer and much more enduring than in individualistic cultures. These many friendships that an individualist might have tend to be more temporary. Like maybe they are my friend while I'm in college, but once I graduate, I never hear from them again. Or they might be more superficial, where we're friends, but we don't really rely on each other. We don't, reciprocate favors. We don't do those kinds of things. It's maybe a more superficial relationship. In individualistic relationships, it's okay to confront your relationship partner. Your friend makes you wait for 30 minutes and you're like, I thought we agreed to be here at 3:00. Where were you? That's perfectly fine in an individualistic relationship. In a collectivistic relationship, the goal is to maintain harmony within the relationship. And you can imagine if you don't have as many relationships and the ones that you have are much more close and enduring, you don't want to sacrifice a relationship by rocking the boat over something as small as 30 minutes tardiness, right? So you'll notice that collectivistic cultures, people don't confront. They don't say directly to their friend, you disappointed me or you let me down. They may never say anything about something that is disappointing in a relationship. They just might let it go because they want to maintain harmony. How do they attribute behaviors? Well, in individualistic cultures, we are much more likely to display what's known as the fundamental attribution error, where we assume that the way that a person is behaving is reflective of their personality. So they're acting like that because that's how they are. Whereas in collectivistic cultures, they're much more likely to say maybe they're acting like that because the situation demands it, or maybe they're acting like that because it's their role, right? Like that's the role they've been placed in. So I apologize, my husband's a firefighter and his beeper's going off. So if you can hear that beeping in the back, that's what that is. So behavior reflects social situations and roles much more often in collectivism than it does in individualism, where individualistic cultures, the fundamental attribution error is much more common. It's less common in collectivism. All right, so that covers a lot of differences between individualism and collectivism. I want to revisit that issue of, all of us are more collectivistic with our close contacts than we are with strangers. All of us are more individualistic when we're making decisions for ourselves than when we are being pressured by a group, these kinds of things. So there's variations within cultures. A lot of times I find that my students kind of fall in love with the idea of a collectivistic attitude, especially those who are raised in the United States with a more individualistic attitude, because it seems more harmonious to be collectivistic. But something that's not on my list that is true is that collectivists are much more likely to display out-group bias, where they assume that the members of their group are better and more deserving and all those things than people who don't belong to their group. So it's very difficult to insert yourself into a collectivistic situation because there's a lot of skepticism, a lot of suspicion that is directed towards members of the out-group, people who don't belong to the in-group, right? So you can imagine if you are collectivistic and you are trying to maintain harmony, you're trying to fit in with the groups that you have, you are fulfilling your social responsibilities, you're doing all the things that are on this list, and then an outsider arrives, you may feel like, well, I don't want to have some kind of duty-based relationship with a new person, right? I don't know you. I don't know if I can trust you. I expect a lot from my friends. I expect a lot in return, right? Like I give a lot and I expect a lot. And so collectivism is not a very open attitude towards new people, and individualism is much more open towards new people. So that's something that's not on my list, but it's very different, right? So yeah, in individualism, you might have a lot of temporary, superficial friendships, but you're willing to, extend friendship to new people and things like that more often in an individualistic approach. So individualism is thought to be the perspective of most Western societies. And when we say Western, we mostly mean, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and then pretty much Western Europe and the UK. Like pretty much that's Western, to a certain extent Israel, to a certain extent South Africa, but pretty much places where sort of the Enlightenment governed people's attitudes. Collectivism is much more common everywhere else. So individualism covers about probably 30% of the population of the world, and collectivism covers the rest. So collectivism is a much more common approach to defining the self and defining roles and stuff like that than individualism is. Honestly, though, you can't really say that one perspective is better or one perspective is worse. One perspective is, colonial and the other is guilt-free or something like that. You really can't say that. Each perspective has pros and each perspective has cons, and each of them, it feels just completely natural to the people who have been raised within it. Now, I have to address the fact that there is a lot of criticism of this model of individualism versus collectivism, and most of the criticism is based on the fact that most cultures are not purely one way or another, honestly. That really every culture has, to some degree, both individualistic tendencies and collectivistic tendencies. Within any culture, the males within the culture tend to display more individualism than the females in the culture tend to display. Females tend to look more collectivistic. And so that's one big variation in how this may display itself in a particular culture. If you take a woman from the United States and a man from China, they may have like the same level of individualism and collectivism, right? But you also, like I already mentioned, will display different kinds of orientations depending on who we're talking about. If we're talking about what, who you should consider first and foremost when making a decision about where to live, should you consider what your parents think when you're an autonomous adult? Should you be concerned about what your parents think about where you should live, or should you be concerned about what your spouse thinks about where you should live? Well, most people would say, well, my spouse first, right? Like that makes more sense, because once you're out of that group that was your nuclear family, then now your new group, your new nuclear family is more important. So it kind of depends on who you're talking about as far as who you should be taking into consideration, things like that. Things that we can see in the United States that are common, that are very uncommon in other parts of the world, would be things like moving for your job, like leaving your family and your network for your job. But it's not unheard of in other cultures. For example, we would not have immigration to the United States from the largely collectivistic sources that we see if it weren't for collectivists being willing to leave their family and their support system and things like that. So it's not perfect. You can't say that, it's black and white. Some people are individualists and some people are collectivists. There's a lot of variation within an individual and a lot of variation within cultures. All right, I think I hit all the criticisms, all the pros and cons, so this is a good time to take a break, and I will see you in the next video.